Prince Louis had entered the room expecting an ordinary family conversation. Instead, he heard a decision that would change where he lived, how he was educated, and how often he would see the people closest to him. King Charles did not hesitate or soften the announcement. At the end of the academic year, Louis would leave his present school and begin a crown-controlled residential education in Scotland. For several seconds, the young prince could only stare at his grandfather and ask one heartbreaking question: why me? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William felt the answer before Charles gave it. Catherine sat beside their son, gripping his hand as silence filled the private room at Windsor Castle. The king had ordered the meeting without tutors, staff, or advisors. A crown-controlled residential academy meant a school under royal supervision, with strict routines, security rules, and long periods away from home. Louis understood one thing: he was being sent away. Charles explained that the arrangement was final. The boy would leave his day school, move to Scotland during term, and begin disciplined preparation for royal life. Louis looked toward William, then Catherine, waiting for someone to say there had been a mistake. Nobody did. Louis asked whether George and Charlotte were coming. Catherine swallowed before saying they would remain at their schools. His expression changed. He asked why his brother and sister could stay together while he had to leave alone. She moved closer and covered his hand, but her hesitation betrayed the truth. She had known before he entered the room. William challenged the order, asking whether the placement remained under discussion. Charles placed a sealed school file on the table. Admission had been approved. The security review was complete. Accommodation near the academy had been arranged. The future king realized his consent was never requested. Louis refused to touch the file. He shifted his chair closer to Catherine, creating a small but unmistakable distance from his grandfather. Then he asked, "Did everyone know except me?" The question struck harder than anger, because it revealed the hurt beneath his confusion. Charles insisted it was not punishment. One recent incident, he said, had proved that Louis needed a different structure. William immediately recognized the reference. Catherine's face hardened because she knew the king was preparing to turn one painful moment into the reason for years of separation. Louis knew where he was being sent, but not why the family decided he was the child who needed to leave. And the answer would expose what each adult feared he might become. To the palace, the announcement concerned education, security, discipline, and royal preparation. To Prince Louis, it meant empty seats at breakfast, missed evenings with his mother, and watching George and Charlotte continue a life from which he would suddenly be removed. Yet every person carried a different fear. Charles feared disorder. William feared history repeating itself. Catherine feared losing her youngest child's trust. And Louis feared something even simpler, that he was being sent away because he had disappointed them. Louis had always occupied a different place inside the family. As the youngest child of William and Catherine, he lived under fewer immediate expectations than George and faced less formal preparation than Charlotte. The Prince of Wales was the title given to the direct heir to the throne, meaning William's eldest son carried a future burden Louis did not. That freedom had shaped the boy's warmth, his honesty, and his instinct to react before royal caution could stop him. Charles saw that freedom differently. The king believed royal children needed discipline before public affection made them careless. He viewed residential education as a place where routine, distance, and responsibility could build strength. To him, separation was not cruelty. It was preparation. William could not accept that argument so easily. He remembered the loneliness of royal schooling and the pressure to adapt without complaint. He feared Louis would not see sacrifice or preparation. He would see rejection. The boy was old enough to understand that he was being removed, but too young to understand why adults called that removal necessary. Catherine felt the danger more sharply. She knew her son grew strongest when he felt secure, included, and close to George and Charlotte. Sending him away would not simply change his school. It could teach him that love became conditional whenever he failed to behave as the crown expected. George heard the argument before anyone meant him to. Later that evening, he stopped outside a corridor as William told Catherine the Scottish placement could not proceed without another discussion. The older boy waited until his parents moved away, then found Charlotte and quietly told her Louie might be leaving. Charlotte entered her brother's room and found him sitting beside his bed. Louie was placing a toy animal, 2 books, and a family photograph into his school bag because he believed Scotland might begin immediately. She knelt beside him, removed each item, and promised he would sleep at home that night. Catherine appeared at the doorway as Charlotte asked why nobody had prepared him. The question cut through every royal excuse. William later assured Louis that nothing would happen without another family discussion. But Charles had already informed the Academy that the future king supported the placement. William now faced a brutal choice: challenge the monarch openly, or allow his silence to become consent. The decision had escaped the sealed file. It had entered the children's bedrooms, divided the adults, and placed William's name beneath an order he had never truly accepted. The decision had not begun with an academic review, a security recommendation, or a private conversation between teachers. It began 3 weeks earlier, during a formal service at St. George's Chapel, when Louis disappeared from the place assigned to him and was found behind a locked choir passage with a distressed young guest. What the public saw as a brief delay, Charles saw as a dangerous breach of order. What Louis believed was an act of kindness became the moment used to determine his future. Louis had arrived expecting ceremony, routine, and the comfort of sitting beside Charlotte. The founder's service marked the anniversary of a historic crown foundation, meaning an institution created under royal authority and protected through generations. Every movement had been timed. Charles would lead the procession, William would follow, and the children were expected to remain exactly where staff had placed them. Louis noticed the crying boy before anyone else reacted. The child, the young son of a palace employee, had become separated from his mother and stood frozen near a side corridor. Rather than call an equerry, a royal assistant responsible for helping members of the family, the young prince left his assigned place and followed him. Charlotte saw her brother disappear, but could not stop the procession. Louis found the frightened child near a restricted choir passage and refused to leave him, even when a chapel official ordered him back. The boy kept asking for his mother. The prince answered that he would stay until someone came. Charles waited at the chapel entrance as the delay stretched beyond the planned moment. Whispers moved through the congregation. William watched aides search the corridors while the king's frustration hardened. To the monarch, the missing child was not only a family concern, it was a public failure of discipline. The security door closed behind Louis and the other boy, trapping them near the choir passage until an officer unlocked it. Nobody was harmed, but the breach exposed how easily a royal child could leave a protected route during a major engagement. That frightened William. It humiliated Charles. Charles confronted his grandson as soon as he was found. He asked why Louis had abandoned his place. The boy answered, because he was crying and nobody stopped. William heard compassion in those words. The king heard dangerous instinct without control. Charles summoned the prince later that evening and issued a private ultimatum. Louis would enter a stricter crown-designed education program or be removed from major public duties. William believed they were discussing tutors and additional security lessons. He did not know the monarch had already ordered his private secretary to reopen an old residential school proposal. Catherine discovered the connection days later through a dated academy record inside the schooling file. The application had been reactivated the morning after the chapel incident. She understood the truth immediately. Charles had not merely answered a security problem, he had used Louis's kindness as evidence that the boy's instincts needed to be controlled. One compassionate choice had become a case against his character, and when Catherine saw how quickly the king had acted, quiet disagreement was no longer possible. Catherine did not request a formal audience, bring an advisor, or send a carefully worded message through palace staff. She walked into the king's private library, carrying the Scottish Academy file, and placed it directly in front of Charles. For the first time since the decision was announced, the monarch faced a parent who refused to discuss Louis as a royal problem to be solved. Catherine spoke quietly, but every word landed with force. "You are asking my son to pay for being kind." Charles looked at the file but did not open it. Catherine had insisted on speaking without aids because she was not entering the room as the Princess of Wales, the title held by the wife of the heir to the throne. She was there as Louis's mother. The king dismissed his secretary and closed the door himself, making the confrontation private and impossible to soften through palace language. Catherine read the conditions aloud. Louis would live in Scotland during term, face restricted family visits during his first adjustment period, receive formal protocol instruction, and appear less often with his family. Protocol meant the strict rules governing royal conduct and public duty. To Charles, those rules offered structure. To her, they threatened to turn one mistake into months of separation. Catherine accused him of misunderstanding what happened at the chapel. Louis had not left because he rejected duty. He had seen a frightened child and acted before the adults around him did. She warned Charles that punishing compassion would teach the boy to ignore suffering whenever royal order demanded silence. Charles did not retreat. The king said kindness without judgment could become danger, especially for a child whose smallest action would attract public attention. Louis would never be treated as ordinary, he argued, and affection could not protect him from consequences. Yet his voice tightened because Catherine's accusation had reached the fear beneath his authority. William entered before either of them could continue. He had learned where Catherine had gone and arrived just as Charles said the placement was recorded, as approved by the Prince of Wales. The title identified William as the direct heir, but he had never given full consent. His agreement to review educational options had been transformed into support for the academy. William's silence became anger. He demanded to know who had authorized that wording. Charles answered by opening another folder and producing a drafted palace announcement. The statement described the move as a united family decision designed to give Louis the strongest possible foundation. Catherine understood the trap immediately. Once released, the announcement would erase every objection and make resistance look like betrayal. She removed the unsigned page and tore it once down the center. She left the school documents untouched. William placed the torn statement beside the academy file and told Charles that nothing would be released in his name until Louis was heard directly. The king answered that children could not determine crown policy. Catherine had challenged the reasoning, and William had withdrawn his consent. But Charles still controlled the machinery capable of turning private judgment into royal reality. The argument in the library did not stop the process. By the following morning, security officers had inspected the Scottish campus, tutors had received confidential instructions, and a royal residence near the academy had been prepared for emergency family visits. Charles did not raise his voice or issue a dramatic command. He simply allowed the crown's machinery to continue moving. Yet behind every signature and sealed schedule stood one human truth. Louis's future was being organized faster than his parents could protect him. Charles possessed more than a grandfather's influence. The royal household controlled security teams, education advisors, travel planning, and the private funding used for specialized arrangements involving working members and their children. That machinery could turn one decision into reality before the family had time to challenge it. The selected academy had educated military families, diplomatic children, and distant royal relatives. Its strict routines appealed to the king. Its isolation terrified Catherine. William felt the pressure when his office received Louis' first-term travel schedule. Dates had been blocked, security movements had been approved, Even the route to Scotland had been planned. The prince understood what resistance would now mean. A public disagreement between the monarch and the heir would no longer look like a private family dispute. It would look like a fracture at the center of the crown. Charles doubted his son would go that far. Alone in his study, the king read an old letter describing how future royal figures must sometimes endure separation in order to learn duty. The words came from a documented family account preserved inside the private archive. He held the letter in one hand and Louis's school photograph in the other. Then he turned the photograph face down and approved the next stage of the academy arrangements. Camilla noticed the speed before anyone expected her to object. The queen consort asked Charles privately whether he was creating a battle that could only be won by hurting Louis. She rarely challenged decisions involving William's children, and her warning unsettled him. The king insisted delay would weaken discipline. She answered that forcing the issue might destroy trust instead. William found his first real weapon inside a confidential assessment from Louis's current head teacher. The documented report described the boy as energetic, emotionally perceptive, and deeply responsive to family stability. It warned that sudden residential separation could create distress rather than resilience. The future king read the final paragraph twice because it directly contradicted Charles's entire case. William prepared to carry the assessment to his father. Catherine stood beside him, no longer asking whether the process could be slowed, but whether it could be stopped. Then a private secretary arrived with news neither expected. Charles had summoned Louis for a second meeting. This time, William and Catherine were not invited. The crown had almost completed the plan. But the moment the king called the boy back alone, the struggle stopped being a dispute over education and became a test of trust. Louis entered the second meeting, believing his grandfather might have changed his mind. Instead, Charles opened a calendar and began explaining term dates, supervised weekends, security rules, and the limited occasions when the boy would return home. The young prince listened until he saw that Charlotte's birthday fell inside a restricted period. Then he stopped the king in the middle of a sentence. He did not ask about uniforms, lessons, or Scotland. He asked whether his sister would celebrate without him. Charles answered carefully. Louis would live at the academy during term, return home during major breaks, and follow a structured adjustment program with limited unscheduled contact. The program meant a fixed period designed to help a student adapt to a new school through strict routines and controlled visits. To the king, it offered stability. To the boy, it sounded like distance being organized in advance. Louis studied the calendar more closely. Several family appearances had been removed. Palace planners believed routine should come before royal engagements during the first year. He saw a weekend outing he shared with George disappear beneath a school commitment. Then he found Charlotte's birthday. The ordinary details hurt more than the grand decision because they showed exactly what he would lose. Charles tried to reassure him. The king said sacrifice formed part of royal life and promised the academy would make him stronger. Louis looked up and answered, "I don't want to become strong by missing everyone." The words stopped the conversation because they exposed what every adult had avoided admitting. Louis returned to the chapel incident. He asked whether helping the lost child had been wrong. Charles said the kindness was not wrong, but leaving his assigned position had created danger. The boy heard something colder. He heard that compassion only counted when permission came first. Charles felt the distance appear in a single word. Louis stopped calling him Grandpa and began saying, "Yes, sir." The formal reply struck harder than William's anger or Catherine's challenge. It showed that the boy no longer saw him as safety. He saw authority. Louis took a pencil and circled Charlotte's birthday. Charles said special arrangements might be possible. The young prince slowly erased the circle and closed the calendar. A possibility was not a promise, and he understood that now. An aide entered carrying a sample academy blazer. Louis did not touch it. He said he would not try it on until William told him the decision was truly final. Charles realized the next move no longer belonged to the crown alone. The king had expected resistance, but not the sudden distance in Louis's voice. William now had to choose between preserving unity with his father and preserving his son's belief that home would protect him. William found Louis awake long after the household had gone quiet, sitting beside the academy blazer he had refused to wear. There were no secretaries, no school files, and no royal titles between them. The future king sat on the floor beside his youngest son and admitted something the palace had avoided saying. He did not know whether obeying Charles would protect the monarchy or wound their family. Louis looked at him and asked only for the truth. This time, William gave it. Catherine remained nearby, but she did not enter. She understood that father and son needed one honest conversation without advisors, protocol, or palace language. William removed his jacket and sat on the floor, placing himself at Louis's level. He did not speak from the doorway. He did not ask the boy to be brave. He simply waited. Louis asked the question everyone else had avoided. Did William believe the Scottish Academy was right for him? The boy did not want reassurance. He did not want another explanation about duty. He wanted his father's real answer, not the answer expected by Charles or the palace. William admitted his fear. He said he had sometimes accepted painful royal decisions because he believed resistance would create greater instability. Silence, he explained, could look like agreement even when someone felt deeply uncertain. The prince confessed that he had allowed the process to move too far because challenging the king seemed dangerous. Louis answered with a truth of his own. Scotland frightened him, but that was not what hurt most. What hurt was knowing that adults had discussed him like a timetable, a security risk, or a future duty. Nobody had spoken about him as a son, a brother, or a child who might feel abandoned. William did not defend the process. He said the chapel incident still required a response, but that response would not begin with removing Louis from home. They discussed private tutoring, supervised independence, security lessons, and gradual responsibility. The boy listened carefully because, for the first time, he was part of the decision. William then made the promise that changed everything. Louis would not be sent to the residential academy. The future king knew confronting Charles could create a serious royal breach, but he said fatherhood could not become another word for obedience. William folded the academy blazer, placed it back inside its box, and closed the lid. Louis moved from the chair and sat beside him. Trust had not fully returned, but it had begun. Louis then asked to be present when William challenged Charles. He did not want to hide behind his father. He wanted the king to understand that refusing the academy did not mean refusing responsibility. William had made his promise in private, but keeping it would require him to face the monarch openly, and Louis intended to stand beside him when that moment came. Before William could meet Charles, the prepared schooling announcement leaked. By sunrise, the decision that had wounded one family had become a national argument about royal childhood, discipline, privilege, and parental authority. A newspaper front page carried a photograph of Louis smiling beside Charlotte, beneath the headline, "The Prince They Plan to Send Away." Outside Windsor Castle, parents gathered with handwritten signs demanding that the young royal remain with his family. The palace could no longer settle the conflict quietly. William understood the danger immediately. The draft palace statement, a formal message prepared for public release on behalf of the royal household, claimed the family was united behind the Scottish Academy plan. Yet sources close to the Wales household refused to support that wording. The contradiction mattered because it exposed what the monarchy had tried to hide. The decision was not settled, and the parents had never truly agreed. Catherine found the newspaper before breakfast and turned it face down. Louis had already seen the headline on a staff member's tablet. He stared at the photograph of himself beside Charlotte and asked why strangers were discussing where he would sleep. She closed the paper, held his face between her hands, and promised the final decision would be made inside the family. Charles watched the coverage from Windsor. One broadcaster described the crisis as a struggle between a grandfather's authority and a father's protection. The king felt personally undermined and believed William's office had allowed the criticism to grow. The prince rejected that accusation. He suspected someone inside the royal household had leaked the statement to force him into public consent. The country divided quickly. Some commentators praised Charles for insisting that royal children should face discipline and equal standards. Others argued that residential separation was being used to solve a security and emotional problem that needed support, not removal. The louder the debate became, the more Louis disappeared beneath the symbol people had created around him. The public response reached its most powerful moment outside Windsor Castle. Parents arrived carrying school bags tied with blue ribbons. One child placed a handwritten card near the gate that read, "Louis should not have to be brave alone." Evening broadcasts repeated the image until it became the emotional center of the entire crisis. Camilla uncovered the truth through a recorded conversation with a senior courtier. The queen consort confronted him after noticing that the leaked wording matched an unreleased palace draft. He admitted releasing it to create pressure for unity before William could object. Charles was stunned. His own household had accelerated the crisis without his final permission. The king cancelled the official announcement, removed the courtier from the matter, and summoned William, Catherine, and Louis to Windsor. This time, the Academy file was not waiting on the table. The public had stripped away the palace's controlled language. The leak had weakened Charles's position, and one final family meeting would decide whether authority or trust defined Louis's future. The final meeting began without a school file, a private secretary, or a prepared palace statement. Charles entered carrying only the calendar Louis had closed during their previous conversation. He placed it in front of his grandson and admitted that he had confused discipline with distance. The king had wanted to prepare Louis for royal responsibility, but instead had made the boy believe that love could be withdrawn when he made a mistake. This time, Charles did not announce a decision. He apologized before making one. William sat beside Catherine, while Louis faced his grandfather in the same Windsor room where the crisis had begun. George and Charlotte remained nearby, but they were not brought into the discussion. Charles wanted no advisors and no institutional shield. A crown-supervised academy meant a school placement controlled through royal security, funding, and formal planning. That machinery had almost carried Louis away from home before his parents could stop it. Charles opened the calendar and spoke plainly. Louis would remain at his current school. The Scottish admission was cancelled. The nearby accommodation would no longer be prepared, and the planned security arrangements would be withdrawn. The decision was permanent. Louis did not celebrate immediately. He watched the king carefully, still unsure whether the change came from love, public pressure, or defeat. Charles answered that doubt before the boy could voice it. The chapel incident had frightened him because Louis had moved beyond a protected route without warning. But fear had led the monarch to treat compassion as a weakness that needed correction. William then established the boundary the family had avoided for too long. He told Charles that decisions controlling his children's daily lives could never again be presented as final before he and Catherine agreed. The prince remained respectful, but his meaning was unmistakable. Royal unity had to be real. It could not be manufactured through silence or a prepared announcement. Catherine felt the room change. Louis would still receive extra security awareness, private mentoring, and supervised chances to practice responsibility. The new plan would strengthen judgment without using separation as punishment. Discipline remained, but distance no longer defined it. Charles asked whether Louis understood why he had been worried. The boy said yes, then added that helping the crying child had still been the right thing to do. The king paused before agreeing. Duty without kindness, he admitted, would leave the monarchy with nothing worth protecting. Charles opened the calendar to Charlotte's birthday and drew a circle around the date Louis had erased. "You will be there," he promised. Louis looked at Catherine, then William, before finally turning back and calling him Grandpa again. The Scottish placement was finished. Louis remained at home. William protected his son without rejecting responsibility, and Catherine restored the safety the boy thought he had lost. Charles did not surrender authority. He redefined it by admitting harm and choosing trust over pride. The file was closed, the academy was informed, and Louis's future was returned to him. Duty had not been abandoned. It had finally been taught its proper limit. No crown, no institution, and no tradition should demand the destruction of a child's trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.